if I could, let me introduce Eric Schmidt to the table. Eric.
Hi there, hi. Yes, hi, Andrew.
Thank you. Thank you, Eric.
What a great 21 years you've had.
It's been fun. What a great, or I don't know, not so great, depending on your view, 48 hours we've just had. I want to talk technology, obviously, and the future, but you are also a great thinker about public policy, about society, about where all this is going, and so I just thought we would start with your reaction to the election news.
I think we should congratulate the next president of the United States. Right? It's a significant achievement. Right? Think about most people did not expect this outcome, and it's a pretty amazing story. Right?
What was your first thoughts?
Well, my support was for the other side.
I know that. Were you surprised?
Yes, I was.
Now, you are involved in a number of things on the other side of this in terms of having invested in a group that does micro-targeting and things. One of the big questions that's emerged from this whole election is the issue of data science and polling. Did you have any better sense than anybody else about where this country was?
I personally did not, and so perhaps that's why I was surprised, but I think everybody else was as well. It's still a new science. And there's an awful lot of people that I know who are sitting there trying to figure out what was wrong with the models, right? Because it's important that we be able to anticipate things. We don't like to be too surprised in this country. And I'm sure that there will be some significant engineering thinking about this. But at the moment, I think we don't know.
So, but you are an engineer by trade. Do you think about the data science issue? I mean, do you think that there was something missing? Do you think it was bad data or bad interpretation?
I would be speculating, and I think at this point it's probably better not to speculate. There's a core problem in polling that people are not answering their phones anymore, and the response rate on phones is very, very low. And of course, mobile phones are typically unlisted. There's just a long list of reasons why the traditional methodology is under attack. This affects all parties, not just the Democratic side. And the pollsters are all trying to figure this out. There have been attempts to modify that using online adjustments, but online is by definition going to be biased to an online user set, not a whole community set.
The only reason I ask is, in a world where we think we know more about each other than ever before, it seemed like in this instance we knew less than we ever could imagine, which is to say that people think that Google, for example, or Facebook knows more about you today in the amount of information that you're willing to share.
Well, we certainly know more than we did before we existed, right? Because we have some data, but there's an awful lot that we don't know. And I think it's best to understand that over decades, the science of data science will get better at everything it does. The underlying math works, right? But it's a function of how good the data is, how good the questions are. If you look at polling, for example, pollsters actually get different results, something because they ask slightly different questions. So it's not quite as straightforward as you might think.
Do you think people are willing to share their politics online as much or more?
Well, what's interesting is there have been some studies about this question about isolation. And another concern that people in my industry have is this sort of, is technology being used to narrow ideas or broaden it? So the rough studies are that a third of people say they never talk about politics to anyone. So presumably their opinions are not expressed until they vote. And roughly a quarter only talk to people who completely agree with them. Right, and by the way, that's true on both sides. So I'm not making a political statement here, and that can't be good, right? Just can't be good. So building computer systems and communication systems that expose people to other points of view and also are resilient to attack. One of the things that I'm very worried about is the rise of misinformation, and I can give you examples on both sides of statements which, when you listen to them, they sound okay, but they can't possibly be true. And so if you sit there and do a little bit of work, you realize that you were either being misled or lied or partially told, and so forth and so on. And this rise of misinformation and then the ability to flood with digital information really can produce some bad outcomes. We have a subsidiary called Jigsaw, which you know about, that has been
Jared Cohen,
which is doing some fantastic work. And one of the sort of interesting problems that happened the last couple of years is that you'll get somebody, I'll use a stereotypical example, a woman who puts out a relatively aggressive statement about something, and then she is harassed in the most vile way by people online in incredibly inappropriate ways, right? And attacked and attacked and attacked. And she goes, I had no idea there were this many hateful men in the world, okay? And the answer is there aren't. That attack was automated, right? These are called trolls. And we've built tools to detect that. That's a good example. We're also working on tools that can use AI to detect essentially programmatically generated hate speech, right? Sort of, you know, the sort of whipping up of the feral images of instances of human emotion. We had an experience with this a few years ago. We did there was this video called Innocence of Muslims, which was truly a terrible piece of work that was uploaded on YouTube, and then there were riots in certain countries. We had to take the video down. It turns out the riots were not from people who watched the video, because they didn't have internet access. It were riots from people who had been influenced by people on television who told them about it in the most explicit and unpleasant ways. So there is a responsibility, you understand this very well because of the New York Times, there's a responsibility for taking a position of trust, right? And to the degree that that position of trust is reduced, right, we've got a problem. Right. And you know, Google's answer to all these questions is a ranking problem. You know, so that's sort of how we think. But there are multiple ways of solving this problem, but we have to face it as a society. If you look, the adoption rate of smartphones is so profound that that is the information tool. And so how people get their information, what they believe, what they don't, is, I think, the project for the next decade.
Let me ask you about the implications of the election in this context on Silicon Valley. This is the New York Times this morning. During the Obama years, Silicon Valley came to see itself as the economic and social engine of a new digital century. Smartphones, social networks became important to world business as oil and the automobile. Mr. Trump's win promises to rip apart that relationship. The incoming president had few kind words for tech giants during the campaign. Mr. Trump promised to initiate antitrust actions against Amazon, vowed to force Apple to make its products in the U.S., and then called for a boycott of the company when it challenged the government's order to unlock a terrorist phone. Mr. Trump's immigration plans are anathema to just about everybody in tech.
The first part of that, the one about Silicon Valley arrogance and exuberance, is undoubtedly true. The second part, I think we don't really know. It's very different, the words in a campaign on all sides, right? We all understand this. Sometimes it doesn't quite come out. If you go back to President Obama's campaign in 2007, look at all the things he talked about, some of which happened, many of which did not. So I think it's best to sort of wait and see. We have a new government being formed. It's going to be an all-Republican team, so think of it as the R, you know, all Rs. And they have a traditional set of doctrinal issues, which are now being challenged by the new president. And I don't think we know. Silicon Valley's general, it's one way to answer your question is to say that the top 5 most valued companies in America today are Apple, Google, Amazon, Facebook, and Microsoft. So if the all-R team is very focused on big business, there's 5 big businesses right there, right? What, again, we'll see if that's really true or not, what do each and every one of those companies need? High value, high quality, high levels of education and immigration. Every one of them is powered completely by those policies, which have been stuck for 20 years. And there have been attempts over and over again to do things which are generally known as stapling the visa to the diploma. Right? There are various forms of this, but basically we bring these incredibly intelligent people into our country. We have the best educational system by far at the college and graduate school level. We kick them out after we give them these incredibly expensive degrees, which we've helped subsidize, and then they go and create competitors to our companies. Right? Now, come on, guys, let's fix that. So there's an opportunity for a test. So Silicon Valley is very clearly united on the importance of open access, open borders, internet connectivity, and immigration of that kind.
Is there any lesson in this campaign about the security of our email? And I say this in the context of WikiLeaks.
I strongly recommend that you not have your own private email server. I strongly recommend that you use Gmail. Is there any question as to my recommendation? Do I need to repeat it to the audience again? Use Gmail, and may I add, you need to use two-factor authentication. Two-factor is the technical term for having a second factor to log you in. So 95% of the attacks, let me just digress because it's important to get this on the record, 95% of the attacks are phishing attacks, where someone sends you a form that says, you need to change your password because Google thinks you're a problem. And inevitably, you being a nice, trusting person of Google, click on this. Of course, it's not from Google. And you change your password, your new password is captured. If you also require a second factor, which is typically a phone number, that process doesn't work. If you type Google two-factor and Apple two-factor, it'll be the best thing you can do during this conference or after or at the lunch break. Trust me, it's well worth it. There are essentially no examples of this kind of problem with people using two-factor, and I think there's going to be an ever-increasing set of problems with people who use just a password.
2 years ago, and you wrote about this in your book with Jared, you spent some time with Julian Assange.
Yes.
What was that like?
Jared and I visited him when he was in I guess, GPS detention. He was wearing an ankle brace now of course he's in a different form of detention in the embassy. Very, very smart. We talked a lot about his view of openness. And his argument that I think was the most compelling was a pretty simple one. And I'm not trying to be in favor of Julian, I'm just trying to report what he said. He said that in his view, governments are capable of systematic evil. And there's lots of little evil, right, of one kind or another. But governments are capable of systematic evil, which requires planning. And that if you have a rule that any form of activity of the government is public, that is leaked, then it's impossible for the governments to get too far to go ahead in evil. The problem, of course, with this argument is he appoints himself as the judge of that.
And so where do you land on that, though? Do you think ultimately we're going to live in such a transparent society that we just assume that do you assume that everything you write now is public?
I think most public figures have to assume that information about them is going to get leaked by someone. And I'll give you a good example. If you go back to Assange and then the more recent leaks out of the NSA, Snowden, et cetera, they're fundamentally easier now than ever because of the ubiquity of hard drives, USB drives, and so forth. An obvious thing that the next president should do is have a division within the federal government that spends its time auditing the security of all the data of our citizens, right? Somebody who actually goes in and says, we cannot have the OPM leak occur again, right? What are we doing about it? In almost every case, we have a technical solution that is available, was not implemented, in order to avoid this kind of problem. But I think that until we take say it differently, we live online now, right? If you grab someone's smartphone, it's equal to or worse than grabbing their wallet or their purse, right? That's that personal a device. So that kind of device, that information is incredibly valuable to both to your friends, but also to attackers. It's important that it be secure.
You were recently appointed to a council that the Pentagon has put together on innovation.
That's right.
Do you imagine, first of all, that council will continue and exist in the same form? I know Jeff Bezos is on it with you. Jen Palka, who's going to be here this afternoon, and Code for America is also on the council.
She's done a great job with us.
Do you expect that to continue under Donald Trump?
This year we started something called the Defense Innovation Board, and the Secretary Carter, who I admire a great deal, asked a set of outsiders to come in and look at how the Pentagon works. And the remit was quite broad. It was around technology and hiring practices and try to bring in some new ideas to what has been a traditionally relatively insular structure of 2.9 million people. So it's a very, very large organization. And what we do is we make recommendations, in this case to him, and then he acts on them. He's already announced a couple. One of the first he did is he announced the creation of a chief innovation officer to sort of host all of this and drive it. That's a good procedural thing and important. And another one is he announced the goal to make computer science a core competency of the department, right? And that means a lot from hiring. We understand that the board that was created is independent of the president and the presidency and so forth. We serve the institution, and so it continues regardless, and we would expect to continue.
So Peter Thiel is not going to become the chairman now?
Well, Peter is welcome to join our board because he's really, really good.
Well, by the way, what did you make, briefly, and then I want to talk AI, what did you make of the backlash that Peter Thiel experienced given his position?
I'm a Peter Thiel fan. I think that he's a brilliant entrepreneur. I like him personally, and I like a lot of the things that he says. It's my personal view. And I think that we want to have a culture where people can speak what they think. I admire what he did.
Fair enough. He was here last year, and we had a tremendous conversation with him then. We didn't really get into Trump. I don't think people thought that Trump was going to get as far as he did, nor do I think Peter Thiel was public back then. Let me pivot and talk about AI and machine learning, but let me do it in this context. One of the things that I was reading in the past 48 hours about the support that Donald Trump received was that there is a large community in this country that feels underserved, that worries about their job, that worries that either is unemployed or worries that they're about to be unemployed. And they worry, dare I say, about technology.
So
and they worry about where all of this is going.
But is that a new fact, or has that always been true? So before we talk about what's possible in the future, let's review where we are in economics. We just finished a 7th or so year after a horrific recession in 2008. The unemployment levels are as low as they've been in many, many years. Wages have risen for middle class and upper middle class and rich people for some years. And in the last year, even the lowest paid service workers are beginning to see labor competition and wage increases, right? So we may feel badly about this, but you take the current economic situation in terms of employment, jobs, and so forth over pretty much all of the previous scenarios by any means. And so my conclusion is you have a couple of things going on. You have immense amounts of information coming to people, but they don't feel that they have the tools to address them, right? Either governmentally or personally or within their corporation. And you also have this sort of pervasive insecurity, which seems to pervade everybody, is their perception of an uncertain future, which they perceive through the media and through the many changes that they see around it. That's sort of my own view of what's going on. But I think the math is the American economy is doing well and the American employment situation is doing well. And if you're confused by that, visit Europe, right? You'll see the difference.
Okay, so let's talk about AI and machine learning. And before we even just table stakes, because I always feel like people talk about artificial intelligence, but they don't really know what they're talking about, which is to say, what is it? And what is the difference, maybe this is the best way to do it, the difference between AI and machine learning that you at Google and DeepMind's, a company that you guys acquired a couple years ago, are doing, compared to perhaps what the folks at Facebook are doing, compared to what the folks at IBM Watson are doing?
Well, the general term AI is referring to systems which have human-like abilities, right, as opposed to, say, calculator-like abilities. And the general descriptions now are something called narrow AI and then AGI, or general intelligence, so the two categories. Let me give you an example of narrow AI. If you use Google Photos and you upload a photo, it knows how to categorize what's in your photo. Now, how does it possibly know that that's a picture of a giraffe or a car or what have you? Well, the answer is it's been trained, right? We showed it picture after picture. And in the 1970s, people tried this and it didn't work. And then there was sort of this, what is called the AI winter, which is sort of about 20 years, and nothing happened. And then a set of mathematicians figured out a way to build what are called deep neural networks. And they are layers of these computer models that are very complicated. And the first layer says, this is a picture, it has boundaries, here are pixels. The second layer says, here are where the shapes are. The third says, here's a shape here, and here's a relationship. And there are typically 9 or 10 levels, and the 10th level says, it's a giraffe, it's a car, it's a person, and so forth. So this development, right, which occurred in the sort of starting really about a decade ago, has driven your use of AI, which you probably don't know. You use it every day when you use any form of speech synthesis, right? That's all AI driven. It doesn't do it with a dictionary. It literally has been trained with patterns, anything involving with photographs and so forth and so on. You mentioned the Facebook technology. Much of what you see there is essentially face recognition of one kind or another with clever algorithms using similar approaches. You mentioned the AI stuff. That's largely linguistic using, again, similar approaches. That's sort of the the layout now. In the last few years, something else has happened, and there are people beginning to work on something which is much broader, with much broader impact. And the easiest way to describe it is to describe the game of Go. So if you're not familiar with it, it's an Asian game. It was thought to be incomputable because there's so many possibilities, right? Because it's the little pieces can be on a 19 by 19 square, and it's combinatorially impossible for computers to handle. And people were pretty sure of this. So a team that we acquired learned how to play games using computers. And what they do is you show it the game on the TV, and the computer figures out what the game is about, figures out what the game is doing, figures out who the players are, and figures out how to win and can beat the human. Right, it's pretty impressive. And they've won a series of awards for that. So with Go, they were able to build algorithms that would look at possibilities on this combinatoric space that were so complicated, and they were actually able to winnow them out. So think of this as a simple form of judgment. You know, I have all of these choices, but I was able to say, I'm only going to focus on this area or this area or this area. And a lot of people believe that this, which is called reinforcement learning, is the beginning of something that's closer to our kind of intelligence. In the industry, there's sort of the optimist and the pessimist, and we define optimism the following way. There are people who believe that we'll get to something which feels human-like in a decade, and there are people who believe that it's going to be 100 years. But the good news is we've got some time to think about it, and a lot of people are working on this.
So paint the picture, though. 10 years, let's do 10 years out, not 100 years. 10 years out, how it impacts the issues that I know that you and I privately talked about, education, healthcare. What does it mean in a very tangible way?
When I've talked about this with groups, everyone immediately focuses on the jobs question. And so let's think about manufacturing jobs. So manufacturing jobs are infinitely safer today because robots do the really dangerous stuff. We take that for granted. But 30 years ago, that was sort of a big surprise, right? And of course, that's happened. Now, what happened to manufacturing jobs is that there were fewer of them, but the ones that were there were higher paying. So computers in manufacturing essentially eliminated the repetitive, the ones that humans don't want to do.
Right.
So my argument for the next decade or so is that the jobs which are routine, boring, repetitive are going to be replaced by this technology. And that's an economic problem. But correspondingly, the same tools make somebody who is of average ability, average interest, what have you, it makes them smarter.
But if you tell me that the computer can learn how to play the game, it can also learn how to do my job, in which case?
In your case, you'll be last on the list because it's hard to do what journalists do, what producers do, the creative industries and so forth. But if you're engaged, let's use this typical example of a radiologist. So everybody here goes to a radiologist, and they take an x-ray and so forth, and they say, oh, you're fine. I would much rather have the computer analyze the radiology picture and then advise the doctor. And I would pay a premium for that because that doctor is going to get a better result. So the way economics really works is that as you move up the skills chain, you get higher income because you have a better service. So in the case of, the reason I mentioned radiology is that the computer vision stuff is better now than human vision. Now that's in and of itself, that's a pretty big deal, right? So what do you do with vision aside from exist, right? Dermatology, radiology, things which involve vision skills. These are relatively automatable, right? And that doesn't mean the dermatologist goes away, but it means that he or she becomes more efficient, does a better job, and is more accurate. There's a simple example here is there's a disease called diabetic retinopathy, which involves looking at the back of your eye. Diabetes is this terrible disease. And you can see changes in the blood vessels. In particular, they actually change their little pattern in the back of your retina. This is a major cause of blindness, especially in the third world. We can now diagnose this using a computer picture of your retina at a much greater accuracy than the best humans can. Now, you sit there and you go, well, how is that possible? It's actually really easy. How many eyes can we show pictures of to a computer? Millions to train it. How many can we show to an ophthalmologist? I don't know. How many do you have to see before you get really beyond bored? Right? 10,000, 20,000? Computers are just better at this stuff. So you should expect that in the next decade, you'll use tools that with humans that make them more efficient, make you safer, more productive. yeah, I think it's speculation. What happens after that?
Let me add to that speculation. This is a guy you know very well, Elon Musk. You know where I'm going with this. He says, I think we should be very careful about artificial intelligence. If I were to guess, like, what our biggest existential threat is, it's probably that. With artificial intelligence, we are summoning the demon, he says. In all of these stories where there's the guy with the pentagram and the holy water, it's like, yeah, he's sure to control the demon. Didn't work out.
Our biggest existential threat is nuclear war, so we're clear. Right? Let's just get the facts right, since I'm things. These systems are trained. So, the Chinese or the Russians or the Americans will create this sort of incredible cyber intelligence that will then attack the other side, right, in some war. But in fact, who has the advantage? The defensive side has more training data. So the defender probably gets the advantage over the attacker in that particular case. So you start thinking about this. Some of the assumptions that we have are different and not necessarily so bad. I am quite convinced that as we adopt all of this technology that we make smarter, although there are bumps in the roads, the result is the continuing pattern of fewer deaths, economic growth, and generally prosperity.
Thank you for that. Let's open it up to questions. I know we have mics around the room, and I imagine we have some people who may want to ask a question. We'll go Socrates style if nobody's got a question. I see Walter Isaacson right over there. You might get forced to ask a question.
Actually,
in a moment.
I didn't realize Walter was in the room. You can answer the DIB question. I should say that Walter is a member of our innovation board.
But watching you run the Defense Innovation Board, how do you think artificial intelligence, without going to classified things, would change the nature of warfare, and what type of ethics board would you need for that?
I don't know enough, and you and I have not even been briefed on what the U.S. is doing, so we can only really speculate on this question. I think it's fair to say that there's a problem with cyber in that the structure of cyber and cyber war has not figured out what the mutually assured destruction deterrence model is. So it seems like countries, as a general statement, can exist in a situation where, like with Russia and WikiLeaks and the attacks in the US, the alleged attacks, I should say, that's sort of a stable state as opposed to a forbidden state. In the commercial world, China has been responsible for the vast majority of the commercial attacks, and yet we maintain good relations with China overall. So it seems like we can exist at a relatively constant level of low-level cyber monitoring. I can't speak for the US, but it's been widely reported that the US did a whole bunch of things as well, and that's sort of a permanent state. What would be, if that's true, we need to come up with some doctrines around what would cause you to not go past a certain point in a cyber attack, right? So is what North Korea did to Sony, is that over and above what was okay, right? The US government said it was. We haven't figured that stuff out yet.
We have a question here, I think, in the second row.
Hi, I'm a professor at Indiana University. I was just wondering, given the theme of the conference is playing for the long term, to what extent is this pressure from shareholders for quarterly, reporting, inducing sort of myopia in the way you manage for the long term? And the reason is, in Europe, there's been a push. 3 years ago, the European Commission actually mandated only semi-annual reporting, as opposed to quarterly reporting, in an attempt to sort of mitigate this myopia that they believe is occurring. So just your thoughts on this issue.
Well, Google famously, in 2004 when we went public, put in a second class of stock, and then indeed now has a third class of stock that essentially gives great powers to the founders and the original owners, of which I'm a member, relative to the other shareholders. This is a model, by the way, also used in the New York Times. And the argument that we made, and we made so publicly, is that a bet on the company is the bet on this team. And as long as it's disclosed, that's fine. We have not faced the question, the hard question that you asked. So we've done okay with the quarterly earnings model. But there's no question that CEOs feel under enormous quarterly pressure, and they do things for the short term that they shouldn't be doing. A classic example is shaving of capital and cash. So they'll plan their cash collections and disbursements on a quarterly basis, which is entirely so they have good results to show, and they shouldn't do that. So any form of revision there, I think, is positive.
I see Mr. Sonnenfeld at the top there with his hand up.
Yes,
Jeffrey
hi.
Sonnenfeld.
A frustration that Secretary Carter has had, and I don't think it was a private issue. If it was, I'm in trouble now, has been that many of your peers have been reluctant to share vulnerability on cybersecurity issues. Until the last 18 months to 2 years, there was not a lot of discussion among your peer CEOs, whether or not it was through antitrust reasons or not wanting to admit vulnerabilities, but you set a different model and were initially criticized by some of your peer CEOs for being open, especially when it came to China. Do you think that CEOs today think differently about sharing corporate vulnerabilities than they did 2 years ago?
There is not a consensus. Thank you, Barry. There's not a consensus on this question. For us, it was obvious that when this happened, we should disclose it. I should also mention the New York Times went through a similar phenomena a few years ago, and we did so at some cost, but it was sort of the right thing to do. And I think it's a function of governance structure. There are a series of legislative proposals that would require various forms of this, and the only way to get a uniform outcome will be to have some regulatory structure that requires some appropriate level of disclosure. This is a classic individual interest versus shared interest.
Let's see if we can sneak another question in real quick over here.
Hi, Rebecca Cooper. I'm from the Kogod School of Business at American University. So I'm going to ask you a question we've been asking all business leaders and thought leaders, including Walter, all year, and then I'm going to ask a question specifically for you. So the question that we've been asking all business leaders is, if you're called to the White House in January and asked by the new president for one policy initiative or idea to grow the economy, what would your one recommendation be? It can be specific to Alphabet or it can be beyond. And then the second question I have to ask you, did you talk to John Podesta about two-step verification process, or what was your conversation with him?
I'm not going to comment about John Podesta and emails. I'll let you talk to him about that. My answer is easy. The number one ask in the tech industry has been the H-1B visa limit cap. We have situations where we have employees who are brilliant, who are condoized. They're literally kept in condos in Vancouver and in other countries, just waiting to clear the auction for H-1B. I would fix that, and I would fix that on day one. If you want the quickest path to increase success in America, fix that problem.
Eric Schmidt, everybody, thank you for kicking off
you all.
today.
Okay.
Appreciate it very, very much.
Okay, Andrew, okay. See, what's wrong with the models, right? Because it's important that we be able to anticipate things. We don't like to be too surprised in this country. And I'm sure that there will be some significant engineering thinking about this. But at the moment, I think we don't know.
So, but you are an engineer by trade. Do you think about the data science issue? I mean, do you think
Well,
that there was something missing? Do you think it was bad data or bad interpretation?
I would be speculating, and I think at this point it's probably better not to speculate. There's a core problem in polling that people are not answering their phones anymore. And the response rate on phones is very, very low. And of course, mobile phones are typically unlisted. There's just a long list of reasons why the traditional methodology is under attack. This affects all parties, not just the Democratic side.
If I could, let me introduce Eric Schmidt to the table. Eric.
Hi there. Hi. Yes. Hi, Andrew.
Thank you. Thank you, Eric.
What a great 21 years you've had.
It's been fun. What a great, or I don't know, not so great, depending on your view, 48 hours we've just had. I want to talk technology, obviously, and the future, but you are also a great thinker about public policy, about society, about where all this is going, and so I just thought we would start with your reaction to the election news.
I think we should congratulate the next president of the United States. Right? It's a significant achievement. Right? Think about, and the pollsters are all trying to figure this out. There have been attempts to modify that using online adjustments, but online is by definition going to be biased to an online user set, not a whole whole community set.
The only reason I ask is, in a world where we think we know more about each other than ever before, it seemed like in this instance we knew less than we ever could imagine, which is to say that people think that Google, for example, or Facebook knows more about you today in the amount of information that you're willing to share.
Well, we certainly know more than we did before we existed, right? Because we have some data, but there's an awful lot that we don't know. And I think it's best to understand that over decades, the science of data science will get better at everything it does. The underlying math works, right? But it's a function of how good the data is, how good the questions are. If you look at polling, for example, pollsters actually get different results, something because they ask slightly different questions. So it's not quite as straightforward as you might think.
Do you think people are willing to share their politics online as much or more?
Well, what's interesting is there have been some studies about this question about isolation. And another concern that people in my industry have is this sort of, is technology being used to narrow ideas or broaden it? So the rough studies are that 1/3 of people say they never talk about politics to anyone. So presumably their opinions are not expressed until they vote. And roughly 1/4 only talk to people who completely agree with them. Right, and by the way, that's true on both sides. So I'm not making a political statement here, and that can't be good, right? Just can't be good. So building computer systems and communication systems that expose people to others. Most people did not expect this outcome, and it's a pretty amazing story, right?
What was your first thoughts?
Well, my support was for the other side.
I know that. Were you surprised?
Yes, I was.
Now, you are involved in a number of things on the other side of this in terms of having invested in a group that does micro-targeting and things. One of the big questions that's emerged from this whole election is the issue of data science and polling. Did you have any better sense than anybody else about where this country was?
I personally did not, and so perhaps that's why I was surprised, but I think everybody else was as well. It's still a new science. And there's an awful lot of people that I know who are sitting there trying to figure out what we're